Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to people listening in on the internet and our brethren over in the Squim congregation as well. Once upon a time, many, many years ago, the Seattle church congregation, which was at that time meeting at the Scottish Rite in Seattle, and a few of you have been around long enough to know what that was like, we decided to have a fundraiser, a social carnival combination, maybe a raffle and a auction at the same time. So everyone was encouraged to look in their attics, look in their garages, their closets, or any other place, and to pull out what to them was maybe still a treasure, but on the other hand, many times it was just junk. It just got moved around from one place to the other. And as you know, you've probably heard that one man's treasure is another man's junk and vice versa. So anyway, we decided to exchange junk, essentially. Anyway, I was elected to be the auctioneer, and in addition to that, I had one other collateral duty, and that was to help with the refreshments. Now, this was sometime in the late fall, and I lived out at Monroe at that time, and there was a farm out in the Monroe area that sold fresh apple cider, and it was delicious. It was really good, and I thought, well, what better way to spruce up this auction than to have apple cider for sale as well, not only to drink but for sale. So I kind of talked to a number of people whose judgment I valued, and I said, you know, what about doing something like this? Would you buy a gallon or two or whatever? And a number of them assured me, oh yeah, we'd buy 2 or 3 gallons. I mean, it's a slam dunk. So armed with that information, and we had about 500 in the congregation at that time, so just conservatively I thought, well, maybe 200 will show up. And if that's the case, if 100 of them buy a gallon, we ought to be able to move 100 gallons with no problem. Right? Anyway, and being conservative, I also thought, well, maybe I ought to have 20 extra gallons just in case there's a run on the cider and we run out. So that Sunday, I went to the farm, loaded up 120 gallons in the pickup, went to the auction, and we started auctioning in the afternoon, but in the interim, the cider was available for sale. So anyway, we started about 1 or 2, and I was, acting as auctioneer. And then there was a little break, so I went to see how the cider looked. And we apparently had sold about 60 gallons, but there were 60 left. And I began to panic a little bit, and so I decided, maybe I'll throw in a gallon with an auction item to make it a little bit more of an incentive to buy. And so I started doing that. And so that helped, move a few more gallons. But as the afternoon wore on, there weren't that many. And pretty soon I was adding 2 gallons and 3 gallons to things. But when the end of the day came and everything was said and done, I still had about, 15 gallons left. And I knew there was no way I could use them all because, after about a week, it starts to ferment. And of course, those who like hard cider, that's great. But in any event, I finally was able to talk a couple of people into buying some, and I ended up taking 10 home. I never lived down that fiasco for a long time, and I finally got to a point where people quit calling me Johnny Appleseed or Johnny Apple Juice. Does God allow us to make mistakes? Does God allow us to make mistakes? And if he does, if he gives us that latitude, should we then allow our friends, our families, our co-workers, family members, church members, employees, that same latitude? Turn to Romans 5, verse 3. Romans 5, verse 3. Paul talking to the Romans here, and he said, "But we glory in tribulations." Now, if you look at that in and of itself, I don't think that many of us, humanly speaking, really glory in tribulations. When we're in the midst of a tribulation or in the midst of a trial, I don't really associate the word glory with it at the time. At the time, I'm thinking, how do I get out of this, or how did I get into it? But Paul says we should glory in tribulations. Also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience. There's a reason for it if you look at it in that way. Strong's Concordance 2716 describes the word worketh as follows. I'm not going to try and pronounce the word itself. It's Katergazomai, katergazomar. But anyway, it means to work, to accomplish, to achieve, to work out, to fashion. All of these descriptive ways define what worketh means. So that's what is supposed to happen if you look at it correctly. It works patience, and patience, verse 4, experience. And experience, hope. And I guess in some ways we could look at the hope as hoping we won't do whatever we did that got us in the predicament we were in that caused the trial. Character, if you think about it, is formed by making choices. If you're not given a choice, then, of course, you're not forced to make a decision. If you're not given a choice, there's no decision required. And if you're not forced to make a decision, you don't have the opportunity to choose between two alternatives, good, bad, or somewhere in between. There may be a certain way to do something, but there may be a slightly better way. And those are some of the things that you think about when choosing. You evaluate which one will have a better likelihood of turning out the way I want it to. Sometimes we think we want happiness, thinking that without any conflict at all in our lives, that we would be happy. If we didn't have any problems, any conflicts, you'd all be happy, right? I'd see numerous smiling faces here if that were the case, but that's not the case. If everything goes our way, if we never have any conflicts in our life, any problems in our life, we would never be able to form character. You have to think about that. If everything goes your way and you never have any conflict, you never have a problem with anything or anyone, you would never have a chance to form character because you'd never have to worry about making decisions, bad decisions. Think about this. A mother approached by a young daughter, and she's watched mommy in the kitchen bake and cook different things, And she heard her mom say something about wanting, boy, it'd be nice to have a chocolate cake tonight. And so she goes in and asks Mommy, well, let's make one. And so her mother, thinking this is a good opportunity for a learning experience, gets the recipe book, opens it up, walks her through the recipe, explains the difference between baking powder and baking soda, the difference between teaspoon and tablespoons, and goes through all of these things, and then sits back and tells her, well, go ahead. Just all you have to do, just follow the directions, and you shouldn't have any problem. So she does, puts it together, bakes it, it comes out of the oven. They sit down and cut a slice of cake. And when her mother tastes that cake, there's so much baking soda in it, not even the family dog will look at it, even though you're not supposed to feed your dogs chocolate anyway, but that's how bad it is. So you write it off, $3 or $4 worth of ingredients, and maybe on, if you're desperate, and I know none of you would ever do anything like this, you go out to the nearest 7-Eleven or overnight grocery store and satiate that desire for a chocolate cake. What about teaching a teenager to drive? You're out on 405 or I-5, and you describe what you need to do when you're going to be taking an exit, that you need to move over into the right-hand lane. So you're right there when the time comes. So you're with your teenager, and you're allowing him or her to make a decision about getting over and taking a certain exit. But unfortunately, they don't do it in a timely way, and you shoot right past the exit. The fact that you have to go 5 miles further down the road to get an exit that'll allow you to turn around may not make any difference normally, but in an emergency situation, in a life or death situation, that's something that is very important. A number of years ago, American Brake Shoes president William Given coined the phrase freedom to fail. He said, men will not take risks and make decisions if they fear it's going to result in their dismissal. They don't want to lose their job, so they won't take a chance. They don't want to risk it. The climate of a company is set at the top by the top managers, and they have to allow mistakes to be made. They have to create a climate where people are not fearful of being fired because of a mistake. If that doesn't happen, they're never able really to develop people with managerial ability because they're not capable of making decisions if they're fearful of being fired. He said, we learn more by our errors than our successes. And he went on to explain that he would rather have the mistakes in his organization to be made at the very lowest level in the organization. If they're not, he said, they come up to me finally in a consolidated form. In other words, many erroneous decisions or lack of decisions or whatever. And he said, if I make a decision, then based on the information presented to me, I'll make $1 million blooper, he said. So that's why he encouraged people to take risks, gave them the freedom to fail. It reminded me, when I was thinking about this, it reminded me something about something in church, about opening and closing prayer. We're told to be brief, not have a lengthy prayer, maybe 5, 10, not 5, a minute or two at the most. And not to try to embellish the prayer so it regurgitates the sermonette and the sermon. You can pick different points from that, but not repeat the entire sermon. Be brief and to the point. This happened a number of years ago. Some of you would recognize the name David John Hill. He came up from the home office, or headquarters as we called it at that time, to visit the Seattle area. And whoever the song leader was asked me to give the opening prayer. And so thinking, here's a chance to really impress an evangelist in the church. So I was trying to think of a good way to segue the last song that was sung just before the prayer. And it was a beautiful song. I don't think it's in our current songbook, but it was "To the Hills I Lift My Eyes." And I don't remember if that was the name. I think that was the name of it. But anyway, I got up there and I said, and thank you, Father, for giving us this service, and to the eyes we lift our hills. And then I paused because I realized what I'd said. And I heard, laughter being stifled in the audience. But anyway, he had a pretty good sense of humor, and I learned a great lesson that day. Jesus had something to say about public prayers. Turn to Matthew 6, verse 5. Matthew 6, verse 5. And when you pray, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of man. Verily, I say unto you, they have their reward. And so, if when you're praying to be seen, that's the reward you get. But here's what you're supposed to do, verse 6. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. And the concept and the principle is the same here if you're praying in public. You blot out whoever or however many people are in the congregation. You're supposed to be praying directly to God. And it's not in secret because obviously people can hear you, but it's the same principle. If you're thinking about, I want to impress someone out there with my eloquence or the way I do this, you're just like the hypocrites. You're looking for some kind of praise from men, and that's not what you're supposed to do. God says, do it in secret. Your personal prayers is a good example, but do it when you open and close prayers in church as well. And when you pray, use not vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. Turn to Luke 5, verse 11. I'm going to look briefly at another example. Luke 5, verse 11. And Jesus, speaking of this well-known parable, a certain man had 2 sons. Verse 11, verse 12, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. So I'm sure he did it reluctantly. And just by way of example and illustration. Say that's modern day, happening today. Say the father had an estate worth $3 million. And since the older son got a double portion of his estate, that which would be $2 million, the younger son was entitled to $1 million. And so he did whatever he needed to do to come up with the liquid funds, and he gave it to his son. And I'm not going to go through the whole story because you know it very well. And the one thing that it doesn't tell the time element between when he got his distribution and when he decided to return to his father, because it said when he had spent everything that he had, and he ended up slopping the hogs, and he finally realized he had it pretty good back with his dad, back helping him. And the world wasn't all that great a place. So he finally repented, came back. His father was overjoyed to see him and threw a great celebration with dancing and, just he was so overjoyed to have his son back. And the older son got his nose bent out of shape and went up and hid in his room, wouldn't even come down and join in the celebration. And so the father went up and confronted him and said in verse 31, after the older son told him, you never did anything like this for me while, I was here. And he said unto the older son, he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. And if you assume there was a time period between the time the younger boy left and when he returned of a number of years, that $2.5 million that the older son would inherit was maybe worth $2.5 million. And his father pointed out to him, everything that I have now, you're going to inherit. The thing that is not made clear here, however, that you have to realize, the young son had to start all over. Now, maybe they gave him a job working in the family business. It doesn't say. It doesn't tell you everything that happened. But he had nothing. And maybe they thought, rather than even let him work there, he should go out and learn what it would be like to earn his own living. I don't know. He made a mistake, and there are consequences for mistakes. And that's why I want to point out, even though some of the examples I've used don't seem to have big consequences to them, a cake or taking the wrong exit, there are other decisions that you are going to make in life that will have major consequences, so you can't ignore them. But God does allow us to make mistakes, so we can see what we will do, how we will handle a certain situation. Will we have learned from a previous mistake that we made? Or will we muff it and do it all over again? Some people do this. They go through repetitive things like this, and they never get the picture. They never get the point. They're repeating the same mistake over and over and over. Well, if God allows that with us, we need to provide that same climate with our children, with our spouse, with our family, with our church family members, with our friends, with the coworkers that we work with. We need to allow that environment where mistakes can be made. We need to learn to be patient and allow for those mistakes. People will grow when they have the climate to be able to make their own decisions. We need to learn the people in our lives that opportunity for growth. Incidentally, I did learn from the introduction that my selection of market research was abysmally inadequate when it came to how many gallons of cider I could sell. And I probably may not be the best choice. On second thought, I can change that to I definitely would not be the best choice to be in charge of refreshments for church auctions, especially if we're planning on selling apple cider.